So I just want to welcome everybody to this webinar today on demystifying clinical trials. Just please remember the information provided in this web seminar is not a substitution for your physician's guidance and care. My name is Sarah Rothschild. I am the Executive Director of the Life Raft Group. It looks like my computer has frozen in some ways. So I'm going to see if I can, you guys can hear me though, right?
I can hear you just fine, Sarah.
Okay, great. So I want to introduce our presenters for today. First, Dr. Haddix is an instructor in medicine at Harvard Medical School, a medical oncologist and clinical translational investigator in the Sarcoma Center and the Center for Cancer Therapeutic Innovation at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. Dr. Haddix's research focuses on developing novel therapies rooted in sarcoma biology and determining mechanisms of treatment response and resistance, particularly in GIST. She joined the faculty at Dana-Farber in 2021, where she currently sees patients with sarcomas and leads clinical trials in early drug development. And we also have the pleasure of Candy Evans, who's a strong GIST advocate and good friend of the Life Raft Group. After dedicating 30 years of her project management profession, Candy recently left her job to focus on her health as a GIST survivor and warrior. Candy is making a difference in GIST research through participation in a clinical trial. She enrolled in the Strategist 1 trial with the University of Miami in February 2024, which helps test the effects of the IDRX-42 experimental drug under the direction of Dr. Jonathan Trent. Her selfless commitment will provide key insights and move science one step closer to finding new treatments for GIST. And Candy's courage underscores the power of individuals to advance medical progress through clinical trial involvement. So it's a pleasure to have these ladies today speaking, and I'd like to hand this off to Dr. Haddix to begin.
Thank you for that introduction, Sarah, and thank you so much to everyone who's tuning in and listening. This is such an important topic, and really would just want to give a background on what a clinical trial is, what it's like to participate in a clinical trial, and just to give you a better understanding of how trials are typically conducted, touch on some key terms, and just leave you with a better understanding of how you could get involved in research if that's what you choose to do. As you heard from Sarah a little bit about me, I'm a medical oncologist and a sarcoma specialist. So I see patients in our sarcoma clinic, both with GIST and other types of sarcomas. And a big focus for me is in clinical trial research. So I lead, design, write clinical trials, primarily in early drug development, but then also have collaborations in the laboratory looking at how we can improve our understanding of sarcomas and GIST and improve on our therapies, really understanding why they work, why they don't work. So that's a big research interest of mine that I apply to clinical trials as well. So as I mentioned, the objectives for this session will be to define what a clinical trial is, explain some of the main phases of clinical trial research, and review some of the common terms and jargon, and hopefully clear that up a little bit. We'll go through some frequently asked questions that I commonly hear from patients in my practice. And then, as you heard, we'll be talking with Candy Evans, who is a GIST advocate and also a clinical trial participant, and will really add some really rich perspective to our discussion today. So hopefully you leave the session today having a better understanding of what to expect as a participant in a trial. I figured I would start off with just some key elements of all clinical trials. I should say that clinical trials really can not just involve drugs, but could also involve studies of medical devices, for example, a pacemaker or something like that, a novel procedure or approach to surgery, a specific lab test or a behavior change like exercise, diet interventions. In this session, we'll be focusing primarily on drug-based clinical trials, but I just wanted to put the context out there that there's a lot of clinical research going on. One key thing to keep in mind is that clinical trials are voluntary. So all of the participants in a study should be informed of the risks, benefits, and alternatives, whether that's standard of care or other trials that they may participate in. And that's all reviewed at the time that the patient signs consent to join the trial. And we'll get into a few more details on what that process looks like. But I wanted to make the statement at the outset that clinical research is voluntary. And overall, the goals of clinical trials, although there could be some nuances to each, the goal overall is to improve care. And this could be through studying a brand new drug that's being tested in patients for the first time, or by comparing a drug that has some data behind it from earlier trials, and we're now comparing it to a standard option to see how it fits into the overall care of the patient. Other key elements of clinical trials, they all sort of follow this template, starting with screening, then treatment, then the end of the study, and then the follow-up period. All of that starts from the time of consent, and all of this is very well delineated in a protocol. So each trial has a protocol. It's usually several hundred pages long that details each step within this overall template. But the main gist of screening is to do testing to make sure that the volunteer is healthy and that they're a good fit for the trial and that the trial is a good fit for them. And each study will have details on what is required for screening in order to make sure that the patient is eligible. And that may include some things like their diagnosis or what specific genetic changes their tumor has, making sure that their organ function is adequate. All of that is completed during the screening period, which usually lasts about 1 month. And then the treatment phase is where the participant actually receives the study treatment, and the disease is monitored over time, usually through scans. Each trial will specify when the trial is over, and that may be that the patient has finished all the planned treatment that is available on the trial, or it may be that the treatment in the trial that's being studied is no longer giving benefit, or there are side effects, or for many reasons, a patient may come off of a trial. And at that time, there's a final wrap-up session, final testing, and going over any side effects that are remaining, et cetera. But just a final wrap-up. And then some trials will also include a follow-up period. And this is where the study team may reach out periodically through phone calls to just check in and see how the patient is doing over time. It's also becoming increasingly more likely that there'll be a pre-screening period. So as trials are testing drugs that are more targeted therapies, there are some efforts before the patient enrolls in the trial to make sure that their tumor has the features that are predicted to give it the best likelihood of responding to the study drug. And in those trials, there's a pre-screening period where the tumor may be tested or something like that before the patient can move forward with the screening for the main trial. And that's called a pre-screening, and there's a separate consent form for that as well. But I just wanted to distinguish it from the rest of the trial. So the process overall, as I discussed, is laid out here. And first, it's the usual first step is to meet with the study team. So you meet with the investigator on the trial, maybe members of the research coordination team, maybe some of the research nurses would be present, and they go over the general protocol and highlight some key features in the schedule and what the medication is like, et cetera. Then from there, if there's a pre-screening, like I mentioned, then the patient and the study doctor could review that pre-screening consent form at that visit and then proceed with the testing for the pre-screening. And if everything checks out, then the main consent form could be signed for the trial. In some studies where there's no pre-screening, this may be the next step after meeting with the trial team. From the time the consent is signed, there's screening tests, which include blood work, scans, maybe some other protocol specified testing that's required. And this again is to make sure that the patient is eligible and healthy. And then the treatment start date will be determined. And from there, it can vary a lot depending on how the drug is given, if it's an oral drug or an IV drug, and that often dictates how the scheduling goes from there. But just to summarize, there would be periodic visits and periodic scans, usually on the order of every 6 to 8 weeks, to make sure that the medication is providing benefit to the patient. Then for whatever reason, as I mentioned, the patient comes off the treatment, there would be a final wrap-up visit, and then there may be some follow-up phone visits as well with the study team. So we've all heard of phases of trials, and that can all be pretty confusing. So I wanted to lay out exactly what is meant by phase 1, 2, 3 trials. But this really all starts back in the earlier stages in a preclinical testing period where there's cancer biology being discovered and testing of drugs early on. And then it moves on to the phase 1, 2, 3, and finally FDA review to see if this treatment will be incorporated into clinical practice. So we'll go into each one of these phases, starting with the preclinical, which is really just discovery work on the cancer in general. Why did the cancers form in the first place? Why do the cancers grow? Are there any signals that we could block with a specific treatment that may be available? Can we tell which tumors may be most vulnerable to the treatment? And then lastly, does the treatment work in the laboratory? And all the while, we're building evidence to move this forward into the clinic, understand how the treatment works, which situations it works best in, and all of that information moves us into the start of clinical research. And the first time a drug is entering a clinical trial in people, there's typically 2 parts to the design. The first is a dose escalation period, and I'll explain what that means. And then the second is a dose expansion period. So during dose escalation, typically based on data that were gathered in the laboratory, the drug will be started in a very low dose that we predict based on all the information that we have that that level is safe as a starting point. Again, that may not be the most effective. It doesn't mean it's not going to be effective, but it's just the lowest safe dose because the goal of this phase is to ensure safety and to protect patients. So initially, usually there's a couple of patients, typically up to 3, that will join at the first dose level. If that all goes well, about 1 month later, usually the study team will meet and decide if everything looks safe to proceed to the next dose level. At that dose level, additional patients will join. And this sort of keeps going until we reach a dose that we feel is safe, effective, and meeting all the metrics to move on. So that's the goal of the dose escalation period. This can proceed in a very linear path where each dose level is marched up the staircase like I showed here, but it can also be kind of confusing where there may be patients that are added at all different dose levels depending on the data that the trial is collecting as it proceeds. So this doesn't have to proceed just up and up and up. It can go in a more scattered direction as we learn more about the drug. I also wanted to mention that there's something called intra-patient dose escalation. So what that means, and this is really recognizing that the patients at the lowest dose level that join here, they may be on a safe dose, but we do like to ensure that patients are at some point getting access to the treatment at a dose that could be effective. So some trials will incorporate this method where once we know that higher doses are safe, these patients in the lower doses can increase their dose so that they're on a more effective dose. This is something that's very pre-specified and locked in on the trial protocol. It may not be available in every study, but it is something that that some trials do incorporate, recognizing that the lower dose levels may or may not be at a high enough dose to see an effect on the cancer. Once we have a sense of what dose is safest and most effective, there may be one or two that are most likely to be the doses that ultimately move forward. Then usually that dose is expanded in what's called dose expansion. And in dose expansion, there are more patients that are given usually just a limited number of doses, dose levels. So for example, there'll be like a collection of patients that join at dose level 2 and a collection of patients that join at dose level 3 to just get more experience with those doses and have more testing available. A few more terms that I wanted to touch on and some of the key goals of this early phase of treatment research. One is safety is paramount, and this is the main goal of these earliest dose levels and earliest phase of the study is to determine the severity and rate. In other words, how often it occurs that there are side effects. And it doesn't matter if they're related or unrelated, the study will track both and collect information on both what the team attributes to be related to the treatment versus unrelated. We're also tracking any changing symptoms that may have been pre-existing at the time the patient joined the trial. Same with medical conditions. If these symptoms or medical conditions are worsening, then that's also something that's tracked on a clinical trial, again, with an aim to really define the safety profile of the treatment being tested. There's also something called PK. PK stands for pharmacokinetics, and it basically means the levels of the drug in the bloodstream. So this is looking at how the body metabolizes the drug over time. And also sometimes they'll look at how the presence of other drugs affect the drug levels in the bloodstream over time to understand how other drugs that the patient may need for other medical conditions interact with the study treatment. And then for oral drugs, sometimes they'll also conduct a food effects study where they're looking at whether it's important to be fasting or non-fasting and how that affects the drug levels. These can mean long days with the treatment team. There's usually only a couple. It's not that every day, every visit would be very long collecting these PK assessments. Usually it's just a few scattered over the very earliest months on treatment. But those days can be longer because they're often checking at the time of the dose, 30 minutes later, 1 hour later, 2 hours later, up to 8 hours later, sometimes 24 hours later. So there's a lot of blood tests that are being checked for just a few days early on in the trial as we're really understanding how the drug is metabolized over time. And then finally, this portion of the trial, although safety is the primary goal, there is data collected on initial signs of efficacy. So how the scans are changing over the course of the treatment. Some trials will require biopsies, or that will be an optional part of the study to have a biopsy taken. And that gives information on whether the drug is working on the tumor as expected. And also which tumors may be most vulnerable. So we're often doing a lot of testing on those biopsy samples to really understand how the drug works or why it doesn't work. So for phase 1 studies, there are a lot of pros and cons. At least this is what I foresee, and we'll see what Candy thinks a little bit later during our discussion too. But I think one pro is that phase 1 studies give access to the latest breakthroughs, and the first time these drugs are being tested. I think on the con side, there's little experience with those drugs since it's the first time we're testing them, and that, depending on the trial design, the patient could be in a lower dose that may not be at the level that's effective for the cancer. So these are some things to consider when weighing pros and cons. The other thing is that there's very close monitoring on a phase 1 study, and it's geared towards safety. So on the one hand, I think that could be a pro. On the other hand, it means frequent, sometimes long visits in the clinic, and that's just something that's more of a personal decision, but something to consider when weighing pros and cons, whether the trial is the right fit for the patient. So the main goal of the phase 1, as I've mentioned, is to determine the drug dose that best balances the side effects and effectiveness. And once that is known and there's a better understanding of the drug levels, the food effects, the drug interactions, et cetera, then it can move on to further testing in phase 2. Now, phase 2 studies come in a few different varieties. One possible design is a single arm study, and this means that all the patients get the treatment. It's usually larger than a phase 1. There may be, for example, 40 patients enrolled, and they're all given the same dose, and everybody gets the same treatment. And the goal here is to get more experience with the side effects and also to confirm how well the drug is working in a larger group of participants. It's also possible in the phase 2 trials that they could be randomized. And this means everyone gets some treatment, but it may not be the investigational treatment to start. So when a patient joins the trial, they may be randomized either to the standard of care therapy or a new treatment, an investigational treatment. And this randomization can be even, so there's the same number of patients in the standard treatment as in the new treatment, or it could be that the randomizer sort of preferentially puts patients on the investigational arm. So in this example I'm showing, for every one patient that's in the standard group, there's 2 patients that are getting the new therapy. And the goal of these studies of the randomized study is to ask, is the new drug better than standard treatment, or at least start collecting evidence to answer that question. There's also the possibility that patients can cross over, and this is something that would be specified in the protocol. But basically, if a patient is on the standard treatment that they could, for example, get off of a trial, and that drug isn't working, they could cross over to receive the new therapy. That's called crossover. So this is something that I'll usually highlight for patients when I'm going over a trial with them, and it's a good question to ask of your study team if there's an arm in the study where a patient could be put in a standard therapy, would ask about crossover to see if that patient could get access to the treatment if the standard treatment isn't working. There's also the possibility, although very rare, that a trial would incorporate a placebo. So instead of having a standard treatment versus the new treatment, there could be a placebo versus the new treatment. This is something that you would be informed of. So the trial would state whether it's a placebo-controlled trial or a standard treatment comparison. You may not know, and your doctor may not know, whether you're on the placebo in a placebo-controlled trial, but you would at least know of the possibility that you could be randomized to a placebo. So that should be stated at the outset. And the reason why I wanted to touch on that in detail is that I've heard from some patients concerns about being on a trial because of fears of being put on a placebo, but that's something that you would be aware of, that possibility, and your doctor would discuss alternatives with you. Or I mentioned with the crossover design, patients that are randomized to a placebo may have the option to cross over to the active treatment if their cancer worsens while on the placebo. The main goal of the phase 2 trial is to build evidence of efficacy while continuing to collect and gain more experience with the safety, the side effects, etc. But the goal is really to see if this is a treatment that stands muster, that can move on to the larger phase 3 study, which is the next type of trial. A lot of the designs that we just mentioned for the phase 2 clinical trials apply here too. So they're usually larger than phase 2, may include several hundred patients. There can still be, as I mentioned, randomization, comparison to a standard, or comparison to a placebo, although that's very rare. And then crossover is also a design element in a phase 3 in some studies. The goal of the phase 3 is, again, to compare efficacy with the standard therapies. This helps us understand how this new treatment fits into clinical practice. And then also, this phase 3 study, one goal is to finish collecting all the information that's needed for review at the FDA to determine if it will be approved to use in clinical practice. So with that background in mind, I figured I would pull in some frequently asked questions that I hear from patients during these discussions in my practice. And one that frequently comes up is, well, when does a trial end? How long am I signing up for this for? So I always say, participation is voluntary. So from the patient end, at any point, if the trial is no longer a good fit, if the treatment isn't working, if the side effects are too significant, if the travel is becoming a burden, if for any reason a patient can come off of a trial for any reason that they want. But more often, patients come off studies if the trial treatment is no longer having a benefit, or if the treatment plan in the trial was designed to stop after a certain period, then the patient would come off the treatment then. Usually, though, the treatment continues until there's no longer benefit to the patient. For the whole study usually finishes after all the patients are no longer on therapy anymore. And they've collected all the information that they set out to collect, and that can take several years. And the other very, very rare possibility, but we do see it happen on occasion, is that whoever is sponsoring the trial, be it the company or the government, or for any reason, they may decide to end the study early. That could be another reason why patients are taken off of a trial and a trial is closed, although, like I mentioned, that's pretty rare. So who sponsors clinical research? The sponsor is considered the responsible party. They're the ones that provide the funding, design the study, and are the sort of last safety net for any questions that come up along the way. This usually is a pharmaceutical company that's developing the treatment, but it could also be a clinical trial investigator like myself. So if I have an idea for a study drug that I think may be effective for patients, I can write and design a trial and be the sponsor of that study. The government is another major entity that sponsors research, and the National Cancer Institute does fund a lot of studies, especially in the phase 1 part. Another thing that comes up a lot is cost. So what is the cost to a patient? I would say, although these trials are meant to be cost neutral, meaning that the usual care that a patient would get while receiving cancer therapy, things like visits to the doctor, routine lab work, scans periodically, those are all billed through insurance, whereas anything that's research oriented, meaning the novel drug that's being tested, any special testing like those PK tests that I mentioned, any research biopsies, that would all be covered by the sponsor of the trial. So it's meant to be neutral in that regard, but we have to recognize that trials typically involve extra time on the patient's part, maybe extra travel. Those long days in the treatment center can mean that you're eating away from home, purchasing meals, etc. So the cost can add up. Some trials do allow compensation for that extra time and travel to help offset the costs. But it's hard to compensate for time, and I think that time is something that that is a cost on a trial for the participants. Another question that comes up is who sees the trial results? So anything that's done for clinical purposes on the trial, like routine blood work, scans, those results are released in the patient's medical record and could be accessible there and would be in their records. Anything that's more research oriented, like those PK tests, the drug levels, any testing that's done on the tumor specimen other than simply checking the diagnosis is correct in the pathology department. If there's any special testing that's done to look at the efficacy of the drug or how the drug works, that's all usually kept with the sponsor. Ultimately, the results are usually published in a way that's de-identified, meaning that it's not linked to individual patient data such that somebody could trace it and there's no privacy concerns. It's all kept confidential, but at a high level, the trial results are usually published. But that would be after the trial has completed, and that's usually several years later. All right, so when to consider a clinical trial? I think this is such an individual decision, but I just wanted to mention that trials may be available at any stage throughout the patient's treatment. That could be like at the time of diagnosis, it could be the first treatment, it could be the second treatment, third treatment. There are things available all along the way. So I think I've heard in some cases that clinical trials are referred to as a last resort. And I think it just depends on the trial. There are some that are exciting and are moving forward even at the earliest stages of the patient's treatment. And then there are some that are very, very investigational, and there may not be as much evidence or experience with that treatment. So there's a lot of variability depending on the trial, but I think it's always good to collect more information on what's available and put that up against what the standard therapies are. More tools in the toolkit are always better. So at least collecting the information on what trials are available throughout the treatment is, I think, a good way to stay informed on all the options. All right, where to find a trial? I think the doctor is the best resource for this. Talking through what trials may be available, what they've heard of, even if it's at another site. That's a good conversation to have with the treating physician. I also think it could be helpful to get a second opinion. Not every trial is available at every center, even the very high volume, most specialized GIST centers, for example, doesn't have all the trials available that could enroll a GIST patient. So it's not a bad idea to get a second opinion, even if you're already at a GIST specialty center. This gives more perspective on what other trials could be available in the future, and just gives us a second set of eyes on the case. So that's never a bad thing. If you are internet savvy and proactive, clinicaltrials.gov can be a good resource. The platform is not as user-friendly, I would say, but it is searchable and there are filters so you can narrow down by the disease type, by the location, things like that. I think that's sometimes can be helpful to just see what's out there and even look more broadly. The other great resource is a group like this, the Life Raft group, patient advocacy groups, share a lot of information, and there are often resources to help patients navigate the system and get additional input from other patients when you're considering something like a trial. I would caution internet search. I think it can be helpful, but it's really hard to know what information is good information. So again, I think these other methods that I listed are great ways to just see what else is out there. If you do find something on an internet search, I would bring it to your doctor to sort of vet it and see if it's something that's really worth your time and in your best interest. So in general, why or why not participate? I think the good is that this is access to the latest treatment, although the evidence may be more limited for a very new treatment. Another good thing is trials improve cancer care in general, and the bad is that some treatments may not be effective, and we don't know that until we do the trial. But it's all contributing to our general understanding and advancing the field. But we always hope that patients do improve from being in a trial and have more access and more options in their treatments. But we have to acknowledge that the reason the trial is being done is to test the effectiveness, and we don't always know that, although we predict it, don't always know for sure that it's going to be a positive outcome in the end. One good thing on a trial is that patients are monitored very closely, but that can also lead to extra burden on time and costs, like I mentioned. And although the check-ins are nice frequently, that can also lead to very rigid schedules and again, a time constraint for the patient. And on a protocol, it's very specific about when the patients need to come in for evaluation, and then there is like a little wiggle room around there, but it can be kind of rigid. And that's not always the best for every individual. Overall, though, I think the one thing that really doesn't have a downside is participating in trials allows a participant to feel a part of something greater. And that's something that I hear frequently from my patients that are on trials, is they appreciate the opportunity to be part of the bigger picture, the bigger efforts to improve cancer care for everyone and for the community. But that's just my perspective from the researcher side, from the clinical trialist side. I think it's so important to hear from an actual just patient and trial participant. So so grateful to Candy Evans for joining today and having a conversation with me about her experience. As you heard from Sarah, she's a wife, a mother of 2 sons. In her professional career, she was a project manager, but also had experience from early stages with her son of being an autism advocate. Now she is a strong patient advocate and participant in trial herself. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so Candy and I can chat a little bit. But Candy, thank you so much for joining and for being part of the discussion. Why don't you start off by sharing your initial feeling about participating in a clinical trial, and what things you had in mind when going into that initial discussion?
Well, absolutely. First of all, I just want to start off by thanking the Life Raft Group for hosting this webinar, and for you, Dr. Haddix. This information you provided was excellent. So I just want to ensure everyone that I am just going to provide the patient experience, and that to the extent of I am one person and this is my first trial. So, and I am new to the GIST community. I was diagnosed with GIST in 2020. At the time, my general oncologist informed me that I did not need to take any type of chemotherapy. That was incorrect. In 2022, it came back metastatic to my peritoneum, and I was devastated. And so I reached out for a second opinion from a GIST specialist, and they referred me to the Life Raft group. And that's kind of where everything just turned around in my life. And so they have provided me everything that I have needed from the point that I, reached out to them. So my initial feeling was when my doctor approached me about going into a clinical trial, was that I told her I didn't want to ever participate in a clinical trial, that I would never consider it because it had not been FDA approved. And I needed to know that it was going to work. And they don't know these things in clinical trials. And so, yes, absolutely. I was never going to join. Famous last words about a year ago that I said to my doctor. So glad I changed my mind on that.
What did change your mind? What did you hear, or what were you thinking that led you to consider it? And how did you weigh the pros and cons?
Well, when she approached me, I was only on my first line, which was Gleevec or imatinib, and it was after my second Sutent failure that I really had to stop and think. I felt like there were only 2 more options for me, It had only been a year, so I wanted to make sure that I, wasn't rushing into the next, therapies. So I stopped and I really thought about what it was that I wanted to do. I did my research at that time, which wasn't the best idea. I should have done it in the very beginning. And I do recommend that everyone does that, even if you don't use that knowledge, somebody else will use it. I promise you, you can help somebody else by paying attention to the next step. And then if you don't use it, please pass it on to somebody else. But to answer your question, what changed my mind on clinical trials in general was I was able, now this was very unique to me, but I was invited to participate in a advisory for a different pharmaceutical company. And that was where I was able to learn about clinical trials. I had attended, seminars and different done some different things learning about clinical trials, but that was where I participated and learned the most. And that's what turned me around and I really wanted to, research if this was going to be a good fit for me. So that changed my mind.
Yes, yes, knowledge is power. Just having kind of what we're doing here today, demystifying what a clinical trial
Yes.
is and taking away that uncertainty, I think can help somebody, just picture if it's right for them or not, as you said. You had mentioned earlier that you had gotten a second opinion, and if you would feel comfortable sharing, what was it like to ask your doctor, and how did that go? I think it's something that a lot of patients are concerned about asking for, and they're worried about how their doctor may perceive that ask. So how did you handle it?
Well, you have to be your own advocate. And so I I obviously had learned that from my previous experience with my son. So I wasn't afraid to ask. I can't say that, although the doctor did tell me that she was fine with me getting a second opinion. I don't know that actually was true. Um, and so I will just say that it doesn't matter. You have to do it for yourself. And you know, uh, what I did was, I reached out. I looked at the doctors. I found the best. I always have to have the best doctors to help me, and so I consulted with Dr. Siklick out of San Diego regarding a surgical intervention to see if that was an option, and it was not for me. He stated that my disease was not in control, and so therefore, if he removed it, that it would grow back. So that wasn't an option, and so that's when I started to look at clinical trials. And I flew across the other side of the United States and went to Miami and found Dr. Trent and his team out of the Sylvester Cancer Center.
That must be so tough to navigate. I mean, seeing from one coast to another, and how did you navigate all of that? What was your support like? What was most helpful to be able to navigate this course that you were on?
Well, my previous experience as a project manager was very helpful in this. Um, what I did was after I talked to everybody, I went to each doctor individually and I asked them, if it were you, what would you do? And would you stay on course with an FDA approved drug? Would you go to this trial, to a different trial? And all three of them stated that they would definitely do a trial. And more specifically, it was the IDRX trial that I'm in that they recommended.
See, I'm sure that was very reassuring to hear such
Absolutely.
consensus that that all your doctors felt similarly, and sometimes things are very straightforward like that, and sometimes it's more of, you know, weighing the pros and cons, and you did the right thing for sure by talking to as many people as you could in your corner to see what was the right fit. And also, I think that's a great question to ask, you know, what would you do? That's such a good question to ask.
Or what would you do if
Doctor.
it was your mom?
Yep, exactly. No, that's a great question to ask. I always appreciate when patients ask me that question. And a lot of times, you know, from the doctor's perspective, we want to lay out all the options for the patient, and we want to, you know, explain all the different, you know, ways that we could move forward. But sometimes that's overwhelming and it's confusing. And as a patient, you just want to hear, what would you do if it was your loved one or yourself? So it's such a good question to ask. Um, so what were some of the things that you would reflect on and say, gosh, that didn't go very smoothly? Participating in a clinical trial is not always as pleasant an experience, and it's can be challenging. So if you don't mind touching on some of the challenges of being a participant on a trial.
Well, I think the challenges can be, you know, the time, as you mentioned before. You have to be able to dedicate the time. And I, you know, at the beginning, it's a lot of time. For me, it was weekly, and it was in a different city, so I had to fly there once a week. And so I had to also consider the travel time as well as the time that I spent there. So that was one of the challenges that I had to overcome, was just, you know, dealing with how much time it took. Um, you know, that the fact that I, you know, doing this, and I'm alone, you know, most of the time, although I have some great friends and family members who have been able to join me, and specifically for my trial, what's nice is they allow me to bring caregivers with me, and that's very helpful because um, you know, I worked in travel for a really long time, so the travel doesn't bother me, but just being alone during this whole entire journey is not something that you want to do. So I have really appreciated the fact that they've allowed me to have someone there with me.
Yes, that is amazing that that's allowed and supported. Um, well, what would you say are tips for current patients that may be in your situation, or considering a trial? What would you say that you wish that you knew that you know now? What are some of the things that you would tell a patient in a situation like yours?
Well, I think first and foremost, you need to be positive and be proactive in your fight. Don't give up ever. Um, Make sure you do your own research and rely on help from others who want to provide you help. Um, you know, stay informed of your treatment options. As I mentioned before, always know, you know, what your next step might be. Um, and then also, um, let's see, what else is a tip? Don't be stubborn. I was stubborn. I said never, and here I am. I think it's important that you, you know, are involved with a team who cares about you. And I think generally in oncology, you find that. I think oncology is the nicest medical professionals ever. But, you know, I have a great team in Miami that really cares about me. And yeah, I look forward to seeing them every month now. I was seeing them every week, but now it's every month, and I miss them. They're like my family, and I really do miss them. It became my second home. So, and I'll go back. Oh, I forgot to mention, I did want to mention one thing. So I am in phase 1 on the dose escalation phase in cohort 7. So I did want to mention that to anybody who might be interested in that information.
Thank you so much, Candy, for sharing. It was such a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope you'll stick around for a few more minutes as we maybe take some questions that other people tuning in might have too. So it looks like Sarah's rejoined us. Hello.
Hello, thank you so much. That was a great conversation, great presentation. Please, for folks who are still on the line, please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A feature. One question that was asked was, if a trial transitions to a later phase, does the previous phase end, or do those participants on the previous phase automatically become participants in the current phase?
Usually a trial, if they enroll, for example, in phase 1, and then later a phase 2 trial is designed and opened, usually the patients that are on the phase 1 study would continue their treatment as long as they're benefiting and could stay on the trial in the phase 1 part, even though the the overall goals and the overall plans have moved on and evolved towards phase 2 or even phase 3. If that patient in phase 1 is still doing well on their treatment, they can usually stay on the treatment.
Okay, great. And you had mentioned that there's different sponsors or trials could come from a drug company or an investigator. Um, with the investigator ones, does that ever lead to a drug approval with the FDA? What happens with those type of studies in terms of if there's a positive result regarding an outcome for the patient community?
Yeah, so that is something that's possible. The investigator-led studies are usually there's a collaboration with the drug company that's manufacturing the drug, and they may still be involved to a capacity. But ultimately, if there's something discovered, like if there's a brand new indication for a treatment, that may be already available as a generic form for something completely different, unrelated to cancer, or just and that study was initially developed and they showed evidence that there's an effect on cancer, then eventually it could evolve to a study where the FDA would ultimately review it to see if there's an indication in cancer. But that would be a long process that would involve a lot of research over time to get to that stage.
Could ever the results of an investigator study be integrated into guidelines, like NCCN guidelines, if there's a positive result?
Yes.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
great. Can you explain the terms that are often reported on a study: complete response, partial response? Is there a standard for how much tumor growth is allowable for a drug trial to be considered successful?
Yes, this is a great question and a good point that I didn't go into much detail on, so thank you for bringing it up. Um, Usually the way that a study measures effectiveness on a trial is based on the scans. So at the outset of the study, at the baseline, there's a scan that's done. And if there are multiple tumors, for example, then each one is measured. Or if there are many tumors, maybe just 5, for example, will be selected. The diameter of each of those tumors is added up to give a total number. And then that total number is compared to at the next scans. So then for the subsequent scans, they would measure the same tumors. They would get that total number and compare it back to the original, etc. If there is 20% growth, that's considered disease progression. And that's where we could conclude that the drug isn't giving benefit, although some trials do allow patients to stay on progression if the patient and the investigator feels that the patient is still benefiting. If there's 30% shrinkage of the total tumor size, then that's considered a partial response. If there's 100%, that's considered a complete response. Between 30% and 100% shrinkage, all of that is partial response. So from, 30% to 99%, that is partial response. Also, from 30% shrinkage to 20% growth, that's considered stable. So I usually explain that in detail to patients to say, if the tumor, grows by 12%, that is considered stable in the eyes of the trial. It doesn't mean that the patient is locked into continuing, because as I said, everything is voluntary. But it is in the eyes of the trial that patient could continue on treatment and be considered stable disease until it passes that 20% threshold.
That was probably the best
And I
explanation
forgot to
I've heard.
mention, very important, it's working. My trial is working, and I had the first month, I had 3.6% shrinkage, and the second month I had 21% shrinkage, and I will go back on June the 6th for my third CT scan. So I am doing absolutely fabulous. So otherwise I probably wouldn't be here.
That's
You wouldn't want to hear
wonderful.
from me, but
Happy
no,
to
it
hear
is
that.
working wonderful, and I don't have any side effects, and I feel great, and it's, yeah, just wanted to throw that in there.
Thank you.
And someone had asked what my mutation was. It's exon 9.
Okay, great. Thank you. And there was another question for you, Candy. Would you have begun this trial before another standard drug had you known about it? Seems like most feel like it's the last ditch effort.
It's definitely not a last ditch effort, because I still have many options available to me. I obviously, like I said, I did it at this stage because I want to save if I need them, which I'm not going to. But if I do need them, I still have other options available to me that have been FDA approved. I think something that's very important when looking into clinical trials is making sure that this one, you talk to people and you know that it's working for other people, and ask specific questions, because once you go on a trial, if you want to get in another trial, they may not let you on right away. So for example, initially people who had been on a trial before were not eligible for IDRX trial. They are now slowly letting other people who've been on trials on the IDRX trial, but initially they didn't. So just make sure that it has the possibility to work for you before signing those papers.
Yeah. Um, Somebody had asked, and maybe we'll just try to clear up some confusion. Do you need to fail a first or a second line treatment before starting a trial? I don't know, Dr. Haddix, if you want to talk about eligibility, of
Yes, it's a good question. It totally depends on the trial. And as Candy mentioned, sometimes that can change over time as they get more information. So some trials will allow patients to enroll that have never had any prior treatment. Some will allow patients to enroll only after they've received all standard options. Some trials will cap the number of prior treatments a patient can have. So each trial has its own eligibility, and it's hard to generalize more than that because it's so depends on each individual trial. But as Candy mentioned, sometimes they may see if they allow all patients to enroll and the earlier patients have had benefit, then sometimes they'll add additional slots for patients to encourage more enrollment into those earlier lines of treatment to get more experience and see if there's really a signal that it could have benefit there too. So things kind of evolve as they get more information.
And I just want to ask one last question, because you mentioned maybe they might open up slots for certain cohorts, but then there's the question also of compassionate use or expanded access, for those who might still want to find a way to get access if the cohort is closed. Can you maybe just speak to that as our last point for today?
Sure. So there There is at times and in certain situations, a path to get access to investigational treatments. That is something that's over the FDA has oversight over. Also, the company that manufactures the drug has to have a path to get patients access to the drug and be in agreement to provide the drug to patients that aren't able to enroll in the trial. So it does take some coordination between the doctor and the site where the patient would be treated, the drug company, and then all the plans are reviewed by the FDA to make sure that it's in the patient's best interest too. So that pathway isn't available in all situations. It really depends on the drug, the company, the doctor, and then overall the FDA.
Okay, thank you. We actually have run out of time. There were some really good questions that came in. We hope to continue to do these type of web seminars often to continue to educate our community. But in the meantime, I just want to express my deep gratitude to Dr. Haddocks for speaking today about this topic, because sometimes we don't have enough time in our clinic to discuss the overview of clinical trials. So this is a recording to keep going back to that I think is worth patients to learn from. And of course, to Candy Evans today for sharing your own personal experience and having the exchange with us. And it seems like there's some interest even from additional questions from participants about your story. So we'll see how we can continue to highlight you in the future for our
Yes,
patient community.
absolutely. And Sarah, let's when we send out the recording, let's somehow figure out how to put my contact information so people can contact me
Okay,
and I can answer more questions.
amazing. Okay, thank you both. And everybody have a lovely day. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.